To our amazing viewers at Hidden Hearth, we'd love to hear which part of the world you're joining us from. Let us know in the comments. Now, let's dive into today's story. My grandma asked, "How's your new apartment?" at Thanksgiving dinner, and I froze. I had no idea what she meant, but what happened next would expose a betrayal that had been hidden for 3 years. My name is Sage Mitchell, and at 22, I thought I knew exactly where I stood in my family. I was the forgotten daughter, the one who didn't quite belong, the reminder of a past my father wanted to bury. But that Thanksgiving evening in our family's colonial home in Hartford, Connecticut, I discovered that everything I believed about my place in this world was built on lies. The dining room was picture perfect that November evening. Crystal glasses caught the warm glow of the chandelier, and the mahogany table groaned under the weight of my stepmother Patricia's elaborate spread. The scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon-spiced sweet potatoes filled the air, creating the kind of Norman Rockwell scene that Patricia loved to orchestrate for her social media posts. I sat at the far end of the table, in what had become my designated spot over the years, close enough to be included in family photos, far enough away to be easily ignored. My stepmother, Patricia, held court in the middle, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the light as she laughed at something my stepbrother Connor had said. At 19, Connor commanded attention effortlessly, regaling everyone with stories from his expensive private college while gesturing with his wine glass. My father, Marcus, sat at the head of the table, beaming with pride as Connor described his latest academic achievements. The same man who'd barely acknowledged my graduation from community college 2 years earlier was hanging on every word of Connor's mediocre performance at a school that cost more than most people's annual salary. But the real queen of the evening was my grandmother, Eleanor Mitchell, my father's mother, who'd driven down from Boston for the holiday. At 75, Eleanor remained a formidable presence, silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She'd built a successful chain of boutique hotels from nothing, and her sharp blue eyes missed very little. "Connor, darling, tell me more about your internship prospects," Eleanor said, cutting into her turkey with precise movements. "I may have some connections in the hospitality industry that could benefit you." Connor launched into an enthusiastic description of his career plans, while Patricia beamed like he'd just announced a cure for cancer. I pushed sweet potatoes around my plate, familiar with my role as the invisible family member. These gatherings always followed the same script. Connor was celebrated, Patricia was praised for her hosting skills, my father basked in reflected glory, and I was simply there. And Sage. Eleanor's voice suddenly cut through the conversation, her attention turning to me with unexpected intensity. "How are you settling into your new apartment in Boston? I hope the neighborhood is everything you hoped for." The fork slipped from my fingers, clattering against my plate with a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Every face at the table turned towards me, and I felt heat rising in my cheeks as confusion washed over me like cold water. I'm sorry, Grandma Eleanor, but I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said carefully, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have an apartment in Boston. I'm still living in the dorms at Hartford Community College." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything. Eleanor's silverware clinked as she set it down, her sharp eyes narrowing as they moved from my face to my father's, then to Patricia's. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I beg your pardon?" Eleanor's voice carried the kind of authority that had built business empires and demolished obstacles. "The apartment I purchased for you 3 years ago? The lovely 2-bedroom and back bay that I specifically chose because it was close to good universities?" My mouth dried. Patricia had gone very still, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the pallor creeping across her face. Connor looked confused, glancing between the adults as if trying to solve a puzzle. My father stared at his plate like it might provide answers to questions he clearly didn't want to face. "Grandma Eleanor," I said slowly, each word feeling like I was walking on thin ice, "I don't know anything about an apartment in Boston. I've been working 2 part-time jobs to afford my dorm room and tuition. I had no idea you'd purchased anything for me." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the antique grandfather clock in the hallway ticking away the seconds, each tick marking another moment of a secret being dragged into the light. Eleanor's face had transformed from pleasant grandmother to prosecuting attorney,
her eyes boring at my father with an intensity that made me grateful not to be on the receiving end. "Marcus," Eleanor said, her voice deadly quiet, "perhaps you'd like to explain why your daughter is living in a dormitory and working multiple jobs when I provided her with a fully furnished apartment 3 years ago." My father's hands trembled as he reached for his wine glass, and I noticed sweat beading on his forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the room. "Mother, I think there might be some confusion about the arrangements." "Confusion?" Eleanor's voice rose slightly, still controlled but carrying an edge that could cut glass. "I wrote you a check for $250,000, Marcus. I told you explicitly that the money was for Sage's housing and education. I even visited the apartment myself before approving the purchase." $250,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to process what I was hearing. While I'd been surviving on ramen noodles and working until midnight at a coffee shop to afford textbooks, there had been an apartment sitting empty with my name on it. While I'd been cramming for exams in a noisy dorm room with a roommate who played music until 3 in the morning, I was supposed to have been living in Back Bay? "Dad," I whispered, my voice cracking, "is this true?" Patricia suddenly came to life, her social hostess mask slipping back into place as she attempted damage control. "Eleanor, darling, I think there's been a miscommunication. The housing situation for college students is so complex these days, and we thought Sage would benefit more from the traditional dormitory experience." "Don't." Eleanor's one word cut through Patricia's explanation like a blade. "Do not insult my intelligence, Patricia. I didn't build a multi-million-dollar business by accepting elaborate lies wrapped in pleasant excuses." She turned back to my father, and I could see decades of disappointment crystallizing in his expression. "Marcus, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want the truth. What happened to the money I gave you for Sage's apartment?" The grandfather clock chimed 7 times, each note reverberating through the dining room like a countdown to judgment. My father looked around the table desperately, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Connor had gone very quiet, seeming to understand for the first time that he was witnessing something that would change our family forever. "The money," my father began, his voice hoarse, "the money went towards family expenses. Connor's tuition, Patricia's medical bills, home improvements that benefited everyone." "Stop." Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more authority than any shout. "You stole from your own daughter. You took money I specifically designated for Sage's future and spent it on luxuries for your new family." The word "stole" hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. I felt tears stinging my eyes as the full scope of what had happened began to sink in. For 3 years, I'd struggled and scraped and worked myself to exhaustion, believing that I was on my own because my family couldn't afford to help me. For 3 years, I'd accepted hand-me-down textbooks and skipped meals to save money, while my father and stepmother were living off funds that were meant to give me a better life. "Sage," Eleanor said gently, placing a hand on my shoulder, "pack whatever you need. You're coming to Boston with me tonight." "Eleanor, you can't just—" "You can and I will," Eleanor interrupted, standing from her chair with the dignity of someone who had never backed down from a fight. "Sage is my granddaughter, and I will not allow her to suffer another day because of your greed and his weakness." She looked at my father one last time, and I saw something die in her eyes. The love and respect she held for her son extinguished by his betrayal. "You have 1 week to transfer the deed of that apartment to Sage's name. If you don't, my attorneys will be in touch." I sat frozen in my chair, overwhelmed by the chaos swirling around me. 3 years of my life suddenly made terrible sense. The sacrifices I'd made, the opportunities I'd missed, the exhaustion that had become my constant companion. All of it unnecessary. All of it because my father had chosen Connor and Patricia over me, just as he'd been doing since the day he remarried. "Sage," Eleanor said gently, placing a hand on my shoulder, "go get your things. It's time you learned what it feels like to be truly valued." The drive to Boston that night felt like traveling through a dream, or perhaps waking up from a nightmare I'd been living for years. Eleanor's Mercedes glided through the darkness of Interstate 84, the silence between us heavy with unspoken truths and 22 years of family dysfunction finally coming to light. I stared out the passenger window, watching the Connecticut countryside blur past, my hastily packed duffel bag in the back seat containing everything I owned that mattered. My mind kept returning to that moment at the dinner table when Eleanor had said the words that changed everything. The apartment I purchased for you 3 years ago. Tell me about your mother, Eleanor said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between Hartford and the Massachusetts border. I turned to look at her, surprised by the question. Eleanor had never talked much about my mother, Sarah, who died in a car accident when I was 7. My father rarely mentioned her either, and I'd grown up with only fragments of memories. The smell of vanilla perfume, the sound of laughter in the kitchen, bedtime stories read in a voice I could barely remember. I don't remember much, I admitted. Dad never talks about her. And Patricia, well, Patricia prefers to pretend she never existed. Eleanor's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Your mother was remarkable, Sage. She was kind, intelligent, and she had dreams for you that your father seems to have forgotten. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Sarah wanted you to go to college, to have opportunities she never had. She made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, I'd make sure you got those chances. The revelation hit me like cold water. She knew you'd look out for me? She made you your backup plan, Eleanor said with a sad smile. She knew Marcus well enough to understand that he might not be strong enough to put your needs first if he found someone new. She was right, wasn't she? I thought about the years after my father married Patricia, how gradually I'd been pushed to the margins of family life. It hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow erosion of my place in the family structure, so subtle that I'd barely noticed until I was completely on the outside looking in. Why didn't you intervene sooner? I asked, and immediately regretted the question when I saw Eleanor's face tighten with what looked like guilt. Because I trusted him, she said simply. I gave Marcus that money 3 years ago and trusted him to do right by you. I should have followed up, should have checked on the apartment, should have insisted on seeing you more often. I failed you, Sage, and I'm sorry. We drove in silence for another few miles before Eleanor spoke again. Tell me about your life at school. Really tell me, not the sanitized version you probably give your father. So I did. I told her about my tiny dorm room with its cinder block walls and broken air conditioning. I told her about working at Java Joe's coffee shop from 5 in the morning until noon, then rushing to classes, then working at the campus bookstore until closing. I told her about eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner because I couldn't afford the meal plan, about wearing the same 3 outfits in rotation because new clothes weren't in the budget. I told her about watching Connor get a brand new BMW for his 18th birthday while I rode a 10-year-old bicycle to work. I told her about Patricia's snide comments about my appearance, my grades, my lack of ambition. I told her about feeling invisible in my own family, like I was a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. Eleanor listened without interrupting, but I could see her knuckles whitening as her grip on the steering wheel tightened. When she finished, she was quiet for a long moment. That ends tonight, she said finally. You'll never have to live like that again. We reached Boston around midnight, and Eleanor drove through the quiet streets of Back Bay with the confidence of someone who knew the neighborhood well. She pulled up in front of a beautiful brownstone building, its Victorian architecture elegant even in the dim streetlight. This is it, she said, turning off the engine. Your apartment is on the 3rd floor, 3B. I stared up at the building, trying to process that somewhere behind those windows was a space that was supposed to have been mine for 3 years. Eleanor produced a set of keys from her purse and handed them to me. I've been having it maintained and aired out regularly, she said. I kept hoping Marcus would eventually tell you the truth and bring you here. I should have known better. The elevator in the building was small, but elegant, with brass fixtures and mahogany paneling. When we reached the 3rd floor, Eleanor gestured toward a door marked 3B. My hand shook as I inserted the key into the lock. The door opened onto a space that took my breath away. Hardwood floors gleamed in the hallway light, leading to a living room with tall windows that would offer beautiful views of the city during the day. The furniture was tasteful and comfortable, a soft gray sofa, a coffee table stacked with books, built-in shelves along one wall. Everything was clean and ready, as if I'd just stepped out for groceries. "The bedroom is through here," Eleanor said, leading me down a short hallway. The master bedroom was larger than my entire dorm room, with a queen-sized bed covered in crisp white linens and a desk positioned by the window. And there's a guest room you could use as a study. I walked through the apartment in a daze, running my fingers along the granite countertops in the kitchen, opening cabinets stocked with dishes and cookware, peering into the bathroom with its clawfoot tub and subway tile. This wasn't just an apartment. It was a home, a real adult living space that suggested someone cared about my comfort and future. "I don't understand," I said finally, sinking into the living room sofa. "If this has been here for 3 years, why didn't Dad ever tell me? Why let me struggle when this existed?" Eleanor sat beside me, her expression troubled. "Because admitting this existed meant admitting he'd betrayed both you and me. It was easier to let you believe the family couldn't afford to help you than to confess he'd stolen your inheritance." "Inheritance?" "The money for this apartment came from a trust your mother and I established when you were born. It was meant to be accessed when you turned 18 to give you independence and opportunities. Marcus was supposed to be the trustee, managing it in your best interests. Instead, he treated it like his personal bank account." I leaned back against the sofa cushions, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had been taken from me. 3 years of living paycheck to paycheck, 3 years of exhaustion and stress, and feeling like I wasn't worth investing in, all of it unnecessary. "What happens now?" I asked. Eleanor pulled out her phone and began scrolling through contacts. "Now you start living the life you should have been living all along. Tomorrow we'll get you enrolled at Boston University. Their spring semester starts in January, and with your grades, you shouldn't have trouble transferring your credits." "Boston University?" I stared at her. "Grandma Eleanor, I can't afford—" "The trust fund your mother and I established will cover tuition, living expenses, everything you need. This apartment is yours free and clear, and there's enough money remaining to see you through a bachelor's degree and graduate school if you choose." For the first time in years, I felt tears of something other than frustration or exhaustion. These were tears of relief, of possibility, of finally understanding that maybe I wasn't worthless after all. "Why didn't Mom tell me about any of this before she died?" I asked. Her expression softened. "Because she thought she had time. Sarah was only 28 when she had you. She thought she'd have years to explain everything, to make sure you understood your worth and your options. She never imagined she'd be gone so soon." That night, I lay in the comfortable queen-size bed in my own apartment, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything that had changed in the span of a few hours. For 3 years, I'd been living a lie, accepting a narrative that I wasn't worth investing in, that I needed to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention or resources my family threw my way. But the truth was different. The truth was that I'd had advocates all along: my mother's foresight, Eleanor's love, and a trust fund established specifically to give me opportunities. The truth was that my father had stolen not just money, but my sense of self-worth, my understanding of my place in the world. As I drifted off to sleep in my own home for the first time, I made a promise to myself. I would never again accept being treated as less than I was worth. I would never again make myself small to accommodate other people's selfishness. Tomorrow would be the first day of the life I was supposed to have been living all along. The morning sun streaming through the tall windows of my Back Bay apartment felt like a revelation. I'd woken up several times during the night, momentarily confused by the comfortable mattress and the absence of my roommate's snoring, before remembering that everything had changed. This was my space, my home, my life, finally beginning at 22 years old. Eleanor arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, carrying coffee and pastries from a bakery downstairs that I hadn't even noticed the night before. She looked impeccable despite the emotional upheaval of the previous evening, her silver hair perfectly styled and her blue eyes sharp with purpose. "Today we begin setting everything right," she announced, settling into the armchair across from where I sat curled up on the sofa. "I've been on the phone with Boston University's admissions office since 7 this morning." I nearly choked on my coffee. 7 in the morning? "Grandma Eleanor, it's Thanksgiving weekend. Nobody's working." She gave me a look that reminded me exactly how she built her business empire. "People work when Eleanor Mitchell calls them, dear. The dean of admissions happens to be a guest at one of my hotels twice a year. Favors get remembered." Over the next hour, Eleanor laid out a plan that was both overwhelming and thrilling. My transcript from Hartford Community College was already being reviewed for transfer credits. An academic advisor would meet with me on Monday to discuss degree programs. The university's financial aid office had been notified that my circumstances had recently changed and that full funding was now available. "But first," Eleanor said, pulling out a leather portfolio, "we need to address the legal situation with your father." She spread several documents across my coffee table, and I recognized my father's signature on multiple pages. Bank statements, property deeds, and what looked like legal contracts covered the surface. "These are copies of all the financial documents related to your trust fund and this apartment," Eleanor explained. "Your father signed papers 3 years ago acknowledging that he was holding these assets in trust for you until you reached majority age. By using the money for other purposes, he committed breach of fiduciary duty." The legal language was intimidating, but the implications were clear. "Are you saying we can sue him?" "We don't need to sue him," Eleanor said, with a smile that reminded me of a chess player announcing checkmate. "We simply need to remind him of the consequences of his actions. I had my attorney prepare this letter." She handed me a single sheet of letterhead from what was obviously an expensive law firm. The language was formal, but the message was unmistakable. Marcus Mitchell had 7 days to transfer the apartment deed to my name and provide a full accounting of how the trust fund money had been spent or face both civil and criminal charges for embezzlement. "Criminal charges?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "When someone entrusted with managing another person's money uses it for their own benefit, that's a felony," Eleanor said matter-of-factly. "Your father may not have realized the legal implications of what he was doing, but ignorance isn't a defense." My phone buzzed with an incoming call, and my father's name appeared on the screen. Eleanor and I looked at each other, and she nodded toward the phone. "Answer it. Put it on speaker. Let's hear what he has to say now that he's had time to think." I accepted the call with trembling fingers. "Hello, Dad." "Sage, sweetheart, we need to talk." My father's voice sounded strained, exhausted. "I know you're upset about last night, but there are things you don't understand about the family's financial situation." "What don't I understand, Dad?" I asked, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "The money your grandmother gave me, it wasn't just for you. It was to help the whole family get on stable ground. Connor's education, Patricia's medical expenses, the house repairs we needed. All of that benefited you, too, indirectly." Eleanor's eyebrows rose, and she gestured for me to continue letting him talk. "So the apartment that was specifically purchased for me somehow benefited me by not existing?" I asked. There was a long pause before my father continued. "Sage, you have to understand you were doing fine in the dorms. You seemed independent, responsible. Connor needed more support, more guidance. You thought it was okay to steal from me because I was managing to survive without the help I was supposed to have been having?" I interrupted, feeling anger building in my chest. "You thought because I wasn't complaining about eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner and working 2 jobs, that meant I didn't need or deserve better? That's not fair, Sage. You're twisting my words." Eleanor leaned forward and spoke clearly toward the phone. "Marcus, this is your mother. Nothing about this situation is fair, starting with the fact that you lied to me for 3 years about Sage's living arrangements. There was a long pause. When my father spoke again, his voice was quieter, more defensive. Mother, you don't understand the pressures of raising a blended family. There are competing needs, limited resources. Limited resources? Eleanor's voice could have frozen water. I gave you $250,000 specifically for Sage's benefit, and you're talking about limited resources? The apartment was too expensive for a college student. Patricia's voice suddenly came through the speaker, and I realized she'd been listening on another phone. We thought it would be better to use the money more practically, for things that would benefit everyone. Eleanor's expression turned deadly calm. Patricia, dear, I don't believe anyone asked for your opinion on how my money should be spent. Now, Mother... No, Marcus, you've had 3 years to explain yourself, and instead you chose to lie and let your daughter struggle unnecessarily. Sage is living in the apartment as of last night, and she'll be starting at Boston University in January. My attorneys have prepared the paperwork to make everything legal and official. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I wondered if they had hung up. Finally, my father spoke, his voice barely audible. What about Connor's tuition? The mortgage payments? We've built our budget around money that was never yours, Eleanor finished coldly. You'll figure it out the same way millions of other families do, through hard work, careful planning, and perhaps a few less luxury purchases. After she hung up, Eleanor and I sat in silence for several minutes. I felt emotionally drained, as if the conversation had forced me to relive years of feeling unworthy and invisible. How long have you known about how they were treating me? I asked. Eleanor's expression grew troubled. I suspected things weren't ideal, but I trusted Marcus to do right by you. I sent money regularly for your expenses, thinking it was reaching you. When I'd ask about you during our phone calls, he'd give vague updates about your independence and maturity. He paused, looking older than I'd ever seen her. I should have insisted on speaking to you directly more often. Why didn't you? Because Marcus convinced me you were busy with school and work, that you preferred to handle things on your own. He painted a picture of a strong, independent young woman who didn't need her grandmother interfering. I was proud of your supposed independence. I had no idea it was actually neglect. That afternoon, Eleanor took me shopping for necessities to stock my apartment properly. We filled the refrigerator with real food, bought proper towels and linens, and picked out clothes that fit properly and weren't threadbare from years of wear. At first, I felt guilty about the spending, conditioned by years of counting every penny. Stop apologizing for needing things, Eleanor said, as I hesitated over a winter coat that cost more than I used to make in a month. This is what normal people do. They buy clothes that keep them warm, food that nourishes them, and items that make their homes comfortable. You've been living below the poverty line while your trust fund sat unused. As we loaded shopping bags into her car, Eleanor's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. It's Marcus, she said. Let me take this. I could only hear one side of the conversation, but Eleanor's increasingly stern expressions told me everything I needed to know. Absolutely not, she said at one point. That money is gone, Marcus. You spent it. You don't get to reclaim it. When she hung up, her face was grim. They want to negotiate. Apparently, Patricia thinks she can convince me to provide them with ongoing financial support to compensate for the money they'll no longer have access to. What did you tell them? Eleanor's smile was sharp as a blade. I told them they had 6 days remaining to transfer that apartment deed, or my attorneys would be filing charges. Some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and revelations that kept reshaping my understanding of the past 3 years. Eleanor had moved into my guest room temporarily, claiming she wanted to help me settle in. But I suspected she was also enjoying the opportunity to right the wrongs that had been done in her name. On Monday morning, we met with the Dean of Admissions at Boston University, a distinguished woman named Dr. Catherine Reeves, who treated me with a respect I wasn't accustomed to receiving from authority figures. She reviewed my transcript from Hartford Community College with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about my academic goals and career aspirations. "Your grades are excellent, Sage," Dr. Reeves said, looking up from my file. "Particularly impressive considering you were working multiple jobs while maintaining a 3.8 GPA. Students who can manage that kind of balance tend to thrive in our environment." The words felt like a revelation. For years, I'd internalized Patricia's criticisms about my lack of ambition and my father's dismissive attitude toward my achievements. Hearing a respected academic validate my hard work and potential was almost overwhelming. "We can accept most of your credits for transfer," Dr. Reeves continued. "With a full course load, you could complete your bachelor's degree in 3 semesters. Have you given thought to your major?" I glanced at Eleanor, who nodded encouragingly. "I've always been interested in business administration," I said. "Specifically, I'd like to learn about hotel and hospitality management." Eleanor's smile could have powered the entire building. Dr. Reeves looked intrigued as well. "That's an excellent field, and Boston University has strong connections with the hospitality industry," she said. "I believe Mrs. Mitchell might be able to provide some valuable insights in that area." As we left the admissions office, Eleanor linked her arm through mine. "Hotel and hospitality management," she mused. "I wonder where you got that idea." "I want to understand your business," I said. "Honestly, I want to learn how you built something from nothing, how you created success on your own terms." Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your mother would be so proud of you, Sage. She always said you had her strength and determination." That afternoon, as we walked through Boston Common, enjoying the unseasonably warm November weather, Eleanor's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and sighed. "It's my attorney. This might be about your father." She answered the call, and I watched her expression grow increasingly satisfied as she listened to whatever news was being delivered. "Excellent," she said finally. "Please proceed with the transfer immediately. And yes, I want copies of everything sent to both my office and Sage's apartment." When she hung up, she was practically glowing with triumph. "Your father signed the apartment deed over to you this morning. He also provided a complete accounting of how the trust fund money was spent over the past 3 years." "What did he spend it on?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Eleanor pulled a folded paper from her purse, a fax from her attorney's office. "Connor's private school tuition, Patricia's cosmetic surgery, a new kitchen renovation, Patricia's BMW, family vacations to Europe, and something called miscellaneous household expenses that totaled over $40,000. I stared at the itemized list, each line representing opportunities I'd been denied while my stepfamily lived in luxury. The cosmetic surgery alone had cost more than I'd earned in 2 years of part-time work. "I'm not surprised," I said, and realized I meant it. Patricia always made sure I knew how much better she and Connor deserved to live than I did. Eleanor's expression darkened. "Speaking of Patricia, my attorney received an interesting phone call from her this morning. Apparently, she's been telling people around Hartford that you've been financially manipulating me, turning me against my own son." The accusation was so absurd I almost laughed. How exactly would I financially manipulate you? I didn't even know you'd given them money until 3 days ago. "That's precisely what my attorney told her representative," Eleanor said with satisfaction. "He also mentioned that making false accusations about someone's character could constitute defamation, particularly when those accusations are designed to damage business relationships." We found a bench near the swan boats and sat down to continue reading through the documents. As I reviewed the financial records, one thing became crystal clear. My father and Patricia had been living far beyond their means, using my trust fund to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford. "What happens now?" I asked. "Do they have to pay the money back?" Eleanor considered this carefully. "Legally, they should. Ethically, they absolutely should. Practically, it might not be possible. People who live paycheck to paycheck while spending other people's money rarely have savings to draw from when the bill comes due. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone buzzed with a text message from Connor. It was the first time he'd contacted me directly in over a year. "Sage, can we talk? Things are really bad at home right now, and I think there's stuff I need to tell you about Mom and Dad." I showed it to Eleanor, who raised an eyebrow. "Interesting timing," she observed. "Now that the money's gone, suddenly Connor wants to have a conversation with you." Should I respond? Eleanor studied my face carefully. "Do you want to hear what he has to say?" I thought about Connor, my stepbrother who'd been the golden child for as long as I can remember. He'd never been actively cruel to me, but he'd never stood up for me either. He'd simply accepted his position as the favored child and left me to fend for myself. "Maybe," I said slowly. "Not because I think he deserves forgiveness, but because I'm curious about what he knows." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Knowledge is power, dear. The more you understand about how they operated, the better protected you'll be in the future." I texted Connor back, agreeing to meet him for coffee the next day in Hartford. I figured neutral territory would be safest, and I wanted Eleanor nearby in case the conversation went badly. That evening, as we prepared dinner in my apartment's beautiful kitchen, Eleanor shared more stories about my mother and the dreams they had for my future. "Sarah was incredibly bright," Eleanor said, chopping vegetables with practiced efficiency. "She could have done anything she wanted with her life, but she chose to focus on being a mother first. She said her career could wait, but your foundation needed to be built early." What kind of career did she want? Teaching. She wanted to work with children who came from difficult backgrounds, kids who needed someone to believe in them. Eleanor paused in her chopping, looking thoughtful. "In a way, that's exactly what she did for you. She made sure you'd have someone to believe in you, even if she wasn't there to do it herself." After dinner, we sat in the living room reviewing course catalogs and planning my academic future. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had genuine choices, real options that weren't constrained by financial limitations or other people's expectations. "Eleanor," I said, using her first name instead of grandma for the first time, "why didn't my father want me to succeed? I understand choosing Connor over me, but why actively hold me back?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "I think Marcus saw your success as a judgment on his failures as a father," she said finally. "Every achievement you made despite his neglect was proof that he could have done better by you. It was easier to keep you struggling than to face the guilt of his choices." "And Patricia?" "Patricia saw you as competition for resources and attention. In her mind, anything good that happened to you was something taken away from Connor." Eleanor's voice carried years of observation and disappointment. "She convinced herself that you were naturally independent and didn't need support, while Connor was delicate and required constant investment." The psychology of it made sense, even if the behavior was inexcusable. Patricia had needed to justify taking resources meant for me and giving them to her biological son. The easiest way to do that was to convince everyone, including herself, that I didn't deserve those resources in the first place. "Will they be okay financially?" I asked, surprised by my own concern for people who had treated me so poorly. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "They'll have to adjust their lifestyle significantly, but they won't be destitute. Marcus still has his insurance job, though he'll probably need to downsize the house, and Patricia will have to find employment. Connor will need to transfer to a state school or take out student loans like most people his age." The idea of my stepfamily facing the same financial pressures I'd lived with for years should have felt like justice. But instead, I just felt tired. I was done being angry about the past. I wanted to focus on building my future. "I keep thinking about all the opportunities I missed," I admitted. "The internships I couldn't take because they were unpaid, The study abroad programs I couldn't afford, the connections I might have made if I'd been at a better school from the beginning. Eleanor reached over and took my hand. Sage, those experiences shaped you into someone who understands the value of hard work and doesn't take opportunities for granted. The students who've had everything handed to them often lack the drive and appreciation that you've developed. Your struggles weren't fair, but they weren't wasted either. That night, as I lay in my comfortable bed looking out at the Boston skyline, I tried to imagine what my life might have looked like if I'd been living here for the past 3 years. Would I have been a different person? Would I have developed the same work ethic and independence that Eleanor seemed to value so highly? I fell asleep wondering if everything had happened the way it was supposed to, even if it hadn't been fair.
The coffee shop in Hartford where I'd agreed to meet Connor was a small, trendy place near his college campus, the kind of establishment I'd never been able to afford to frequent during my own school years. I arrived 15 minutes early, wanting to choose my seat and prepare mentally for whatever conversation was about to unfold. Connor arrived exactly on time, but he looked nothing like the confident, carefree young man I'd seen at Thanksgiving dinner just 5 days earlier. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive clothes wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. He ordered a large coffee with extra shots of espresso and sat across from me, fidgeting with his phone before finally putting it face down on the table. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, his voice lacking its usual smooth confidence. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me after everything that's happened." "I'm curious about what you have to say," I replied honestly, "but I'm not here to make you feel better about your family's choices." Connor winced at my directness, but nodded. "I deserve that. Sage, I need you to know that I didn't know about the apartment until after Thanksgiving dinner. I had no idea Grandma Eleanor had given Dad money specifically for you." I studied his face, looking for signs of deception. "But you knew our family's lifestyle was beyond what Dad's salary could support." "I thought Dad had gotten a promotion, or maybe Grandma Eleanor was helping everyone equally," Connor said, running his hands through his hair. "I know that sounds naive, but I didn't question it because I didn't want to know if the answer was uncomfortable." His honesty was unexpected, but it didn't absolve him of responsibility. "You never wondered why I was working 2 jobs while you got a new car?" "I told myself you wanted to be independent," Connor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom always said you preferred doing things on your own, that you'd be insulted if we tried to help too much." Patricia's manipulation had been more thorough than I'd realized. She'd managed to convince Connor that my struggles were a choice, not a necessity, allowing him to enjoy his privileges without guilt. "What's happened since Thanksgiving?" I asked. Connor's composure cracked, and I saw tears forming in his eyes. "Everything's falling apart, Sage. Dad's talking about selling the house, Mom's having panic attacks about money, and they're both blaming each other for the situation with Grandma Eleanor." He pulled out his phone and showed me a series of text messages from Patricia. The language was increasingly desperate, filled with complaints about Eleanor's manipulation and demands that Connor help convince his grandmother to restore their financial support. "Mom wants me to call Grandma Eleanor and apologize on behalf of the family. She thinks if I can convince her that we're all sorry and that we'll include you more going forward, maybe she'll change her mind about cutting us off." The calculated nature of this approach was breathtaking. Even in the face of consequences for their actions, Patricia was still trying to manipulate the situation rather than genuinely making amends. "What do you think about that plan?" I asked. Connor was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee absently. "I think it's desperate and probably won't work. But Sage, I'm scared about what's going to happen to our family. Mom's never worked. Dad's income alone won't cover our current expenses, and I don't know how I'm going to afford to finish college." For the first time since he'd arrived, I felt a flicker of sympathy for Connor.
He was facing the same financial uncertainties I'd lived with for years, but he'd never developed the coping skills or work ethic to handle them. "Have you considered getting a job?" I asked. Connor looked at me like I'd suggested he start juggling fire. "I'm taking 18 credit hours this semester, and Mom says working would interfere with my studies." "Connor, I worked 30 hours a week while taking 15 credit hours and maintaining a 3.8 GPA. It's not impossible. It just requires better time management." He absorbed this information with visible discomfort. "I don't know how to get a job. I've never applied for anything, never had an interview. Mom always said my job was to focus on school." The conversation continued for another hour, with Connor revealing more details about our family's financial situation and his own sheltered perspective on real-world responsibilities. As we prepared to leave, he said, "Sage, is there any chance you might talk to Grandma Eleanor? Not to get money back for us, but just to, I don't know, maybe help me understand how to move forward?" I considered his request carefully. Connor had been complicit in the system that kept me marginalized, but he'd also been manipulated by the same people who had stolen from me. "I'll talk to Eleanor," I said finally, "but not to advocate for your family. If you want guidance about becoming more independent, that's something I can support." Connor's relief was visible. "Thank you, Sage. I know I don't deserve your help, but I don't know who else to turn to." That evening, I shared the conversation with Eleanor over dinner at an upscale restaurant in Back Bay. She listened thoughtfully as I described Connor's fears and his apparent genuine ignorance about the family's financial deception. "What do you want to do?" Eleanor asked me when I finished recounting the conversation. "I think Connor might be worth helping," I said slowly. "Not his family, but him specifically. He's been raised to be helpless, but maybe he can learn to be different." Eleanor smiled approvingly. "Your mother had the same generous spirit. She always believed people could change if they were given the right opportunities and incentives." "Would you be willing to meet with Connor? Not to give his family money, but to help him understand what real independence looks like?" Eleanor considered this for many minutes, sipping her wine thoughtfully. "I'll meet with him on one condition. He has to demonstrate that he's serious about changing. I want to see him get a job, start paying his own expenses, and show genuine effort to become self-sufficient before I'll invest any time in mentoring him." Over the next 2 weeks, Connor surprised everyone by following through with his commitment to change. He found a part-time job at a bookstore near his campus, started cooking his own meals instead of eating out constantly, and even moved from his expensive off-campus apartment to a more affordable room in a shared house. Patricia was furious about these changes, calling me repeatedly to complain that I was turning Connor against his family and making him act like a poor person. Her complete inability to understand that Connor was simply learning to live within his means revealed just how skewed her perspective had become. Eleanor agreed to meet with Connor after he'd been employed for 2 weeks and had successfully managed his own budget. The three of us had dinner at my apartment, and I watched Eleanor evaluate my stepbrother with the same sharp assessment she probably used for potential business partners. "Why do you want to change now?" Eleanor asked Connor directly. "What's your motivation?" Connor thought carefully before answering. "Because I realized I don't actually know how to do anything useful," he said. "Sage has been independent and successful while dealing with obstacles I never had to face. I want to be someone who contributes instead of just taking." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "That's a good start. But understanding the problem is easier than solving it. What specific steps are you willing to take?" By the end of the evening, Eleanor had agreed to provide Connor with guidance and mentorship, not financial support, but advice about building a career, managing money, and developing the kind of character that created lasting success. "Your mother always said that people should be judged by their willingness to grow, not just their past mistakes," Eleanor told me after Connor left. "If he's genuinely committed to changing, he deserves the chance to prove it." Watching Connor begin to take responsibility for his own life was unexpectedly satisfying. It didn't undo the years of unfair treatment I'd experienced, but it showed that growth and change were possible even for people who'd been part of the system that had hurt me.
Spring semester at Boston University began with an energy and optimism I'd never experienced in my educational journey before. Walking across the campus with textbooks I'd purchased new instead of borrowed, wearing clothes that fit properly and kept me warm, living in an apartment that was actually mine, everything felt surreal in the best possible way. My business administration courses were challenging but engaging, and for the first time, I could focus entirely on learning without the constant distraction of wondering how I'd pay rent or buy groceries. My professors treated me as a serious student with valuable perspectives, and my classmates accepted me as an equal rather than the scholarship kid who didn't quite belong. Eleanor had introduced me to several people in the hospitality industry, and I'd landed an internship at one of Boston's premier hotels. Unlike the exploitative part-time jobs I'd worked in the past, this position paid well and offered genuine learning opportunities about business operations, customer service, and management strategies. "You're thriving," Eleanor observed one evening as we shared dinner at my apartment. She'd been staying in Boston more frequently, claiming she needed to oversee some property investments, but I suspected she simply enjoyed having family nearby who genuinely appreciated her presence. "I feel like myself for the first time," I admitted, "like I'm finally living the life I was meant to have instead of just surviving whatever circumstances other people created for me." 3 months into the semester, I received an unexpected phone call from my father. I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken since that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, but curiosity won out. "Sage." His voice sounded older, more tired than I remembered. "I hope you're doing well in Boston." "I am," I replied carefully, not volunteering additional information. "I wanted you to know that Patricia and I are getting divorced," he said without preamble. "The stress of our financial situation, combined with the guilt over what we did to you, has been too much for our marriage to handle." I felt a complex mix of emotions: sadness for the destruction of their relationship, relief that Patricia would no longer be in a position to influence family dynamics, and a kind of justice that their betrayal had ultimately cost them more than it had cost me. "I'm sorry to hear that, Dad," I said, and meant it. "Sage, I need you to know that I take full responsibility for what happened with your trust fund," my father continued. "Patricia encouraged the spending, but I was the one who had legal authority over the money. I should have protected your interests instead of prioritizing other considerations." It was the first time he'd taken complete ownership of his actions without trying to share blame or make excuses. The apology felt genuine, even if it came years too late. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "It doesn't change what happened, but it means something to hear you acknowledge the truth." "Is there any possibility of rebuilding our relationship?" he asked quietly. "I know I've lost the right to call myself your father in any meaningful sense, but I'd like to try to earn back at least some small place in your life." I looked around my beautiful apartment, thought about my thriving academic career and promising internship, considered the loving relationship I'd developed with Eleanor and the genuine friendships I'd formed at school. "I'm not ready for that yet," I said honestly. "Maybe someday, but not now. I need to keep focusing on moving forward rather than trying to repair the past." My father accepted this with grace I hadn't expected. "I understand. If you ever change your mind, I'll be here." After we hung up, I called Eleanor to share the conversation. She listened thoughtfully before offering her perspective. "Your father is facing the natural consequences of his choices. Sometimes people need to lose everything before they can understand what really mattered.
Whether he's genuinely changed or just desperate remains to be seen. Connor had been making steady progress in his journey toward independence. He'd maintained his job at the bookstore, earned decent grades while working, and had started dating a young woman who shared his growing interest in personal responsibility and self-improvement. He called me occasionally to share updates or ask for advice, and our relationship had evolved into something resembling actual sibling affection. I never realized how much energy it takes to be constantly worried about money, Connor told me during one of our phone calls. I don't know how you managed it for so long without becoming bitter. I had to choose between becoming bitter or becoming stronger. Bitterness would have hurt me more than it hurt anyone else. As my first semester at Boston University drew to a close, Eleanor and I began discussing summer plans. She wanted me to spend July and August working at her flagship hotel in downtown Boston, learning the business from the ground up. This isn't nepotism, she clarified. You'll start at entry level and work your way up based on merit, but you'll have access to mentorship and learning opportunities that money can't usually buy. It was exciting and intimidating. I'd be working alongside experienced hospitality professionals, learning about an industry I hoped to build my career in, and continuing to develop my relationship with the woman who'd become not just my grandmother, but my closest advisor and friend. On the last day of classes, I walked across campus reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed in just 6 months. I'd gone from struggling to afford textbooks to earning Dean's List recognition. I'd moved from a cramped dorm room to a beautiful apartment in one of Boston's most desirable neighborhoods. Most importantly, I'd transitioned from feeling like an unwanted burden to understanding that I was valued, supported, and capable of achieving anything I set my mind to. That evening, Eleanor and I celebrated my academic success at the same upscale restaurant where we'd had dinner the night I'd learned about Connor's situation. As we raised our glasses in a toast to my future, Eleanor shared something she'd been holding back. Your mother left you more than just the trust fund. She pulled an envelope from her purse. She wrote you a letter to be opened when you turn 21. But given everything that's happened, I think now is the right time. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope and unfolded the several pages written in handwriting I didn't recognize, but somehow felt familiar. My dearest Sage, the letter began, if you're reading this, it means I'm not there to guide you through the challenges of becoming an adult woman. But I want you to know that everything I did, every plan I made was designed to ensure you'd have the tools and opportunities to build whatever life you choose. The letter continued for several pages, sharing my mother's hopes for my future, her insights about navigating relationships and career decisions, and her absolute faith in my ability to overcome any obstacles I might face. You come from a line of strong women, she'd written. Your grandmother, Eleanor, built an empire from nothing, and you have that strength within you. Never let anyone convince you to settle for less than you deserve, and never apologize for taking up space in the world. By the time I finished reading, tears were streaming down my face. Not tears of sadness, but of gratitude for the love and foresight that had shaped my path even before I was old enough to understand it. She knew, I whispered to Eleanor. She knew I'd need these words, this encouragement. Eleanor nodded, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. Your mother was wise beyond her years. She understood that the most important inheritance she could leave you wasn't money. It was the knowledge that you were loved unconditionally and capable of extraordinary things. As we left the restaurant that night, walking through the warm spring air toward my apartment, I felt the last pieces of my old identity falling away. I was no longer the unwanted stepdaughter, the scholarship student, the girl who worked 2 jobs to afford textbooks. I was Sage Mitchell, business student, hotel industry intern, beloved granddaughter, and inheritor of dreams that stretch back generations. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, in my own home, preparing for a future that was entirely mine to shape. I thought about Patricia's attempts to make me feel unworthy, my father's willingness to sacrifice my opportunities for his new family's comfort, and the years I'd spent believing I didn't deserve better treatment. All of that felt like someone else's story now. I was finally living the life my mother had envisioned for me, supported by a grandmother who understood my worth, building toward a career that excited me, and surrounded by people who valued my contributions rather than taking them for granted. At 22 years old, I was just beginning to understand what I was capable of achieving.
That brings us to the end of our story here at Hidden Hearth. What started as a simple Thanksgiving question revealed a betrayal that had been hidden for years, but also uncovered the love and support that had been waiting for Sage all along. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe to Hidden Hearth for more stories where family secrets come to light and justice finds its way home. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest episodes, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Remember, every family has secrets, but not every family has the courage to face the truth when those secrets threaten everything they hold dear. Until next time, this is Hidden Hearth, where the most extraordinary drama unfolds behind ordinary doors.